Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Appalachian frontier. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the summer of 1862, a figure named Isaac Harlan rode into the remote valley of Clearwater Ridge, on the outer edge of the Appalachians, under an overcast sky and a stifling stillness. He claimed a distant inheritance, land deep in rugged terrain, forested slopes rising sharply, and hidden hollows beneath. Wells and springs dotted the rise, but isolation prevailed. Villagers in the neighboring settlement of Mossy Hollow told of thunderous roars striking at night, cattle vanishing, children hearing whispers in the dark. Harlan arrived with two younger brothers, Ambrose and Gideon, and a few laborers. His stated aim: survey the boundary lines, clear timber, and begin modest farming to repay debts. The Harlans bore a long but obscure lineage in the Appalachian fringes. Local tax lists from 1855 reference a Jonathan Harlan, petty proprietor, Washington County, whose holdings dwindled over a decade. Some believed the family had moved from lands across the Tennessee border. In Fayette's 1859 deed records, the name Harlan appears beside disputed plats near creeks flowing down to the Nolichucky, but no clear meaning emerges. Over time, gossip drifted of secret transactions, land deals in neighboring Giles County, and rumors of a pact with a shadowy figure calling himself Marston. The Harlans' reputation in Mossy Hollow was uneasy. Neighbors recalled that Ambrose once strode past the church on Sunday morning, face ashen, muttering, "They come in the night," but no one pressed. When Isaac first set foot on the ridge, the forest was damp. Fog curled along ridgelines, and the smell of damp leaves hung heavy. He hired two local woodsmen, Carter and Rowan, to help map and stake boundaries. Their first trip uphill that evening returned shaken. Carter claimed he glimpsed a broken stone slab in a hollow, its inscriptions faint and bizarre, letters unlike any known script. Rowan insisted he heard low chanting carried on the wind, though he could not translate a single word. They abandoned the site until daylight. Isaac dismissed their fear as nerves, ordering a return the next day. At Mossy Hollow, the local constable, Jeremiah Coulter, grew uneasy. He had heard of unexplained disappearances along the frontier in recent years, often suppressed in county journals. The Appalachian region in this era was fraught, as the first American frontier describes, with isolated properties slipping out of oversight, speculative purchases, and secrecy around land dealings. Google Books +1. The incompleteness of records and scattered affidavits often leave gaps in any account, a pattern that would haunt how the Harlan case is remembered. Soon after the boundary staking, the first serious incident, Carter failed to return from a solo recon mission at dusk. His horse was found tied near the edge of a ravine, but Carter was gone. Rowan brought back a fragment of torn cloth, dark and damp from the underbrush by a collapsed limestone outcropping. Isaac sent local men on search parties, but no trace of Carter appeared. The hollow near the stone slab was sealed in shadow, too overgrown to explore fully without risk. That first vanishing unsettled the few neighbors. One farmer, Elijah Moore, told his daughter later, "I heard the holler of a man in the dark, and that was no deer call." Others whispered of the ridge that drinks blood, or those buried alive beneath the stones. Some old-timers recalled similar stories farther east decades before. In Appalachian lore, remote valleys sometimes harbor ancient tombs or pacts with unseen powers, always mentioned in hushed tones. Isaac, meanwhile, pushed forward, ordering a digging crew to inspect the hollow, but he insisted on secrecy, limiting knowledge to only his brothers and a trusted foreman named Wesley Yates. By autumn 1862, the ridge lay silent under red leaves. The initial reports from the crew: disturbed soil, charcoal traces, smashed bone fragments mixed with iron nails, and a narrow chamber hewn into bedrock. No formal coffin, only crude blocks. Journal notes mention a brittle ledger among the rubble, partially burnt, entries dated 1848 to 1855, referencing payments to Marston, ridge route, and odd sums labeled for silence. The handwriting was spidery, in two hands. Neighbors learned snippets. Yates collapsed during inspection, refusing to speak about what he saw. Isaac kept a watchful guard over the site. Coulter, the constable, tried to file a report with county records in neighboring Washington, but was rebuffed. Records claimed the property was contested, with overlapping claims, and the ledger was inaccessible. Meanwhile, Maple Ridge, a nearby settlement, lost 3 sheep in one night. One returned gutted, the ground stained. An old woman, Martha Jenkins, said she heard voices chanting around midnight near the ridge, though she could not make out words. The valley slipped into uneasy quiet. Isaac wrote to his brother Gideon in a letter, now preserved in a family archive. "I fear what we unmasked that night sends tremors beyond our control." Gideon replied, "If any should vanish, are you and Ambrose bear the burden." The ledger hinted at a wider network. Payments from Giles, Claiborne, Hawkins counties. My silence held. Could the pact the ledger recorded extend beyond Clearwater Ridge? By early winter of 1863, snow crept across Clearwater Ridge, sealing trails and isolating the Harlan property further. The townsfolk of Mossy Hollow rarely ventured beyond the creek. Even the post rider began dropping mail short of the ridge. The family's few visible movements were the lanterns seen at odd hours. Midnight, sometimes later, burning in the upper barn. Constable Coulter wrote in his 1863 report draft, found later among unfiled notes, "The Harlan men have ceased trade, ceased worship, ceased all manner of neighborly conduct. They are in seclusion, as though counting the minutes until judgment." Isaac's youngest brother, Gideon, began keeping a private log that survives in fragments. One passage, written shakily, reads, "Ambrose no longer prays. He hears the voice of that thing beneath. The pact was spoken. I told him it was only the wind." Another entry mentions the second offering, but the context is lost. The page torn. In the nearby settlement, Reverend Abner Lewis told his parishioners not to wander near the ridge. He cited afflictions of spirit brought by the trespassers of old ground. Whether he spoke from superstition or local warning, none can say. The Reverend's journal, preserved in the archives of Fayette County, also notes that 2 surveyors employed by Isaac Harlan departed for Knoxville but never arrived. Their trail vanished. Somewhere between the Nolichucky and the French. Broad, it was around this same period that a scholar from Virginia Polytechnic Institute, Professor Caleb Sutton, passed through Mossy Hollow. He was collecting regional legends and early settlement patterns, work later cited in the First American Frontier, the same reference that documents how these ridgeland societies often mixed faith, fear, and secrecy in equal measure. Sutton's brief note from January 1863 mentions a hollow where trade and oath crossed the same threshold. He did not stay the night. The Harlan homestead became the center of every fireside whisper that winter. Some said they were grave robbers seeking Confederate gold. Others swore they were descendants of an older sect from Virginia's hills. Still others believed that the brother's ancestor, Jonathan Harlan, had broken a vow decades earlier, one that demanded restitution in blood or soil. Then, in February, a fire was seen high on the ridge. The glow lasted several hours before vanishing into snow and smoke. When searchers reached the site days later, they found no bodies, only scorched beams and an open pit where the cellar had been. The pit extended deeper than expected, roughly 10 feet down, revealing a passage shored with rotted timbers. A note found nearby, possibly Isaac's, contained a single line. "What was promised is beneath. We dare not close it." By the thaw of 1864, the Harlan property stood abandoned, charred, silent, and already half reclaimed by the forest. Mossy Hollow's residents avoided the trail leading up the ridge. Travelers passing through described the trees leaning unnaturally, as if bending toward the collapsed cellar. Constable Coulter made one last official visit that March, accompanied by a deputy and 2 hired scouts. His written account, preserved in the Fayette archives, stated, "The soil gives like hollow ground. Air rises as from a tomb." They uncovered fragments of pottery, small bones, and a rusted lockbox containing several folded documents, receipts, coded entries, and the faint outline of a seal marked M.H. Perhaps for Marston Hollow, that name, Marston, had already entered the whispers of Mossy Hollow. Some claimed Marston was an alias for a Confederate deserter turned smuggler. Others said he was not a man at all, but a relic of an older belief carried by settlers from the Blue Ridge valleys. One elderly witness, Abigail Greer, described hearing her grandfather tell of the Marston Bargain, a story stretching back to before 1820, when mountain families were said to trade something sacred for unending harvests. Throughout that spring, villagers noticed faint tremors at night. The ridge would shudder, and animals bolted from their pens. One man, Jacob Vance, reported seeing a light in the abandoned cellar, a pale flicker like someone moving with a lantern below ground. He refused to go nearer than 50 paces. Around this time, Professor Caleb Sutton returned briefly to the region, following reports of unusual ground shifts near the old Harlan tract. His journal, quoted decades later in a study connected to the first American frontier, describes the area as a monument to vanished oaths. The land itself seems to breathe unease. Sutton interviewed local families and confirmed that the Harlan name had effectively vanished from tax rolls. The property's title reverted to the county, though no one would purchase it. By summer, nature had begun to swallow the remnants: wild blackberry brambles, fallen timbers and creeping moss across scorched stones. Yet hunters still heard tapping sounds echoing from beneath. One swore he saw what looked like footprints pressed into mud, leading out of the cellar mouth, though no prints led in. Coulter's deputy left one final note before his death that autumn: "The ridge keeps count. There are more now than were buried." Rumors spread that the Harlan brothers were sighted in neighboring counties, one in Abingdon, another farther north under an assumed name. Yet no confirmation came. The war's chaos swallowed many records, and it became impossible to distinguish fact from fright. By 1865, Clearwater Ridge was declared uninhabitable terrain in the county survey. A new road bypassed it entirely, leaving the hollow to rot and memory to fill the void. The spring of 1866 brought heavy rains that scoured the slopes of Clearwater Ridge, exposing stones and old timbers that had lain buried since the fire. The county surveyors sent to mark flood damage found the cellar pit collapsed inward, its timbers blackened, and within the debris, remnants of ledgers, melted glass, and a tarnished locket engraved with the initials A.H. One surveyor, Thomas Brindle, later remarked in an affidavit, "The air in that hollow was foul, like the breath of something sealed too long." Word reached Professor Caleb Sutton once again, and his curiosity drove him to file a letter to the Fayette Archives. He referenced the event in his later studies of Appalachian settlement secrecy, which scholars would connect decades later in the first American frontier. Sutton described how in those years, frontier families in isolation often built social codes and silences around property lines, oaths in his words, that outlived the men who swore them. The Harlan story became one of his favorite teaching examples, though he avoided attributing supernatural claims. Locals, however, had their own version. By 1867, stories of the Pact under the ridge had spread along the valleys. Children whispered of hearing knocks from beneath the ground when passing the ridge road. A farmer, Ezekiel Rowe, swore that he saw two men digging near the hollow by moonlight, but when he called out, both folded into the fog like smoke. When he returned at dawn, only the shovel remained, the handle freshly worn. At the same time, County Clerk Samuel Delmore began re-examining old land records, prompted by a petition from an out-of-state claimant, a supposed cousin of the Harlans, Mrs. Ellen Whitlow of Roanoke. Her letter demanded legal title to the Harlan tract, known locally as the Ridge Lot, but her testimony, preserved in deposition, grew confused. She referred to the sealed promise of 1835 and blood rights surrendered by Gideon. Delmore dismissed the petition as incoherent, yet attached it to his files, perhaps sensing its strangeness. As Reconstruction reshaped much of the South, Mossy Hollow remained curiously frozen. While new towns formed along the railroad to the west, the hollow stayed cut off. No new settlers, no new church, only the memory of that ridge and its burned homestead. One young schoolteacher, Anna Leary, wrote to her sister in 1868 after moving into the region, "The people here do not speak the name Harlan aloud. I found the ridge path blocked by fallen oak, and in its shade lay stones carved with what seem letters, but none I know. The children call it the sleeper's ground. They say the wind there is warm even in frost." By 1870, the Hollows Trail had nearly vanished. The road grew overgrown, and maps began omitting its name entirely. But the legend persisted, sometimes as a curse, sometimes as a warning. The Fayette County Courier printed a short note in December 1871. "No man should disturb the ridge. The earth has taken what it was owed." The Harlan story seemed destined to fade into myth, until, years later, an unexpected discovery drew the ridge back into the record. In 1873, a construction crew from the New Appalachian and Western Railway Company began surveying possible routes through the region. Their goal was to link the trade lines between Knoxville and Abingdon, cutting through valleys that had remained untouched for decades. One of their survey points ran perilously close to Clearwater Ridge, by then overgrown, silent and long absent from official maps. The crew chief, Nathaniel Briggs, later filed a terse report describing a sinkhole of abnormal depth that interfered with the alignment. The soil around it was warm despite the season. When his men lowered a rope, they struck what seemed to be wooden planking about 12 feet down. Upon clearing debris, they uncovered a crude passage, collapsed in parts, smelling faintly of ash. Briggs, believing it to be the ruins of the Harlan cellar, noted in his log, "Structure possibly of antebellum origin, built without record or plan. Air stagnant. Evidence of fire." Within days, the project site began to unravel. One worker fell ill after inhaling fumes from the hole. Another, a young man named Caleb Dorsey, went missing overnight. His partner swore he had gone to fetch water but never returned. Dorsey's hat was found beside the opening, the brim half burnt as though singed by sudden heat. Briggs ordered the shaft sealed with loose stone and timber, but his men refused. They left the site within the week, abandoning equipment. The event made its way into the Fayette County Registry, where an anonymous clerk appended the marginal note, "This is the same tract once held by Isaac Harlan, known for disappearance and oath." That was the first time in nearly a decade that the Harlan name appeared in county documents. Meanwhile, Professor Caleb Sutton, now older and teaching in Richmond, corresponded with local officials after hearing rumors of the rediscovery. In a surviving letter, he referenced the account from the first American frontier once more, writing, "What began as trade and kinship in these mountains became a culture of concealment." The Harlan case, though obscure, exemplifies that uneasy balance between possession and damnation. The region endured another tragedy soon after. A lightning storm struck the slope in the summer of 1874, setting a portion of the forest ablaze. Witnesses in Mossy Hollow described the fire line moving in a perfect ring around the ridge, as if circling something unseen at its center. When rain finally smothered the flames, the inner hollow remained untouched. Not a leaf burned, not a branch singed. That phenomenon was enough to renew whispers in the neighboring valleys. The Knoxville Gazette ran a small column titled, "The Ridge That Would Not Burn." Reporters tried to visit but found the path impassable. One journalist, Henry Tolley's, wrote afterward, "The ridge resists both man and time. It is as though the soil denies intrusion." By the end of that year, all plans to extend the railway through Clearwater Ridge were abandoned. The company rerouted miles east, leaving the hollow unmarked once again. In Mossy Hollow, the locals said quietly, "The Pact holds." By 1876, the memory of the Harlans had settled into a strange middle ground between superstition and civic embarrassment. The Fayette County Board, pressed by regional investors, attempted to reopen property assessments on abandoned lands, including the tract near Clearwater Ridge. Officially, it was recorded as Lot 11 unclaimed former Harlan holdings. A new surveyor, Mr. Elias Wharton, was assigned to appraise the land. He was meticulous, a man of arithmetic more than folklore, and kept a daily field journal. On his first ascent, Wharton noted that the terrain quivered underfoot like sod laid on hollow boards. Beneath his compass readings, he scrawled, "No birdsong beyond the third marker." 2 weeks later, Wharton failed to report back. His horse returned to Mossy Hollow lathered in sweat, saddle still strapped. Searchers found Wharton's journal near a creek bed. The final entry, written in a shaking hand, read, "They are not gone." The ground hums as if remembering, "There is a door that breathes." Following this, the county abruptly halted all plans for reappraisal. The page in the ledger that had listed Lot 11 was later found torn out. In the same year, a traveling preacher named Reverend Jonah Pike arrived in the area, claiming divine direction to the Hill of Broken Covenants. Locals believed he referred to Clearwater Ridge. He gathered a small following of desperate farmers and widows, promising that cleansing prayer would drive out the old corruption. The group ascended the ridge one misty morning in July. Only Pike returned. Witnesses described him walking back barefoot, clothes scorched, face streaked with soot. When questioned, he murmured, "It opened for us. Then it closed." He vanished from Mossy Hollow days later, leaving behind a single scrap of scripture pinned to the chapel door. The wages of silence are paid in kind. Later that autumn, Professor Caleb Sutton received word of the preacher's expedition. In correspondence preserved among his estate papers, he compared the Harlan case to older European patterns of land pacts and revenant myths, again referencing examples described in the first American frontier. Sutton wrote privately that the Appalachians held echoes of older fears reborn in new soil. His letter ends abruptly with, "And yet, some oaths here are older than the written record." By 1878, the ridge was once again considered cursed ground. The path leading there was deliberately obscured. Trees felled across it, stones rolled to block passage. No one in Mossy Hollow claimed to know its exact location anymore, and those who did kept their silence. Still, on still nights, travelers on the old stage road swore they saw a faint orange glow flicker deep within the trees, as if a single lantern moved beneath the earth, tracing an endless path back to a buried promise. By the time 1880 arrived, the story of the Harlan clan had grown into a quiet regional legend, one seldom spoken aloud, but known to every child raised within 50 miles of Mossy Hollow. The older generation referred to the ridge as the rooted hill or the ridge of debt, implying that something owed long ago still awaited settlement beneath the ground. The area's few remaining settlers had learned to keep their distance. Hunters gave it a wide berth. Wagon routes curved unnaturally east. Even the county's post-rider confessed to taking the long loop rather than passing by its base. In the county courthouse, an unmarked box of brittle documents, property deeds, unsent letters, fragments of Wharton's maps, was stored beneath the clerk's desk, labeled simply Harlan. No one volunteered to catalogue it. That year, Dr. Marion Hale, a physician from Johnson City, began collecting accounts of frontier disappearances for a private research paper. He arrived in Mossy Hollow in the summer of 1880, hoping to interview witnesses of the original Harlan settlement. He found few survivors, but the recollections he gathered painted a disturbing picture. An elderly woman, Mrs. Abigail Greer, described how her husband once heard the earth breathing like a beast asleep near the ridge. Another local, Thomas Vance, said he'd found bones washed down after the spring floods, thin as bird bones, but shaped like hands. Hale's notes, later referenced in a symposium on Appalachian folk pathology, mentioned that every witness suffered from the same symptom after recalling the events: sleeplessness followed by fever. Hale dismissed supernatural causes, but added, "The fear here is inherited, not imagined." Meanwhile, records show that Reverend Pike's followers, those who vanished in 1876, were never declared legally dead. Their families kept a yearly vigil each midsummer night, leaving jars of lamp oil along the ridge road. One such vigil in 1881 drew a handful of onlookers. A farmer, Nathan Ross, testified that he saw faint figures by the trees that night. 3 shapes, unmoving, as if carved from ash. His account was later dismissed, but the detail about 3 persisted in later retellings. Aligning eerily with the number of Harlan brothers, the Knoxville Courier carried a small article titled "Haunted Lands of Fayette" in late 1882, describing the ridge as a wound in the earth that will not heal. Reporters again cited the work of Professor Caleb Sutton, who had by then passed away, yet whose earlier notes on Appalachian secrecy, preserved and summarized in the First American Frontier, continued to lend a scholarly frame to these otherwise rural superstitions. By the close of 1883, the county officially marked Clearwater Ridge as restricted woodland. No one was to build, mine, or timber within a mile, and so silence reclaimed the ground. Still, a few travelers told of a low sound heard at night near the boundary stones, steady, rhythmic, like the slow turn of a distant wheel beneath the soil. The year 1885 brought the first organized attempt to document Clearwater Ridge in a formal historical survey. The Appalachian Folklore Society of Charleston, founded by a group of teachers and amateur historians, dispatched 2 members, Edwin Miles and Clara Wainwright, to catalogue legends of the region. They arrived in Mossy Hollow in September, carrying notebooks, a portable camera, and an almost naive enthusiasm for uncovering the truth behind the ridge. Locals were polite but distant. The innkeeper, Mr. Rowe, refused them lodging for more than 2 nights, citing unsettled airs in the valley. He warned them not to camp near the creek. Still, Miles insisted on hiking the ridge trail with a guide named Daniel Pruitt, one of the few men who remembered the path's old markers. According to Clara's surviving journal, the group reached the clearing by dusk. "The trees lean inward," she wrote, as if shielding something from the sky. They found remnants of scorched stone and what appeared to be part of a foundation wall. Beneath one rock, they discovered a length of iron chain and a warped horseshoe, likely relics from the Harlan homestead, though no tool marks or nails remained. Clara noted a strange warmth in the soil, even in the cooling night air. That evening, they set camp a short distance downslope. Miles recorded faint vibrations in the ground shortly after midnight. He described them as the rhythm of a pick striking earth far below. Daniel Pruitt left the camp before dawn, refusing to return. His only explanation: they were counting again. The remaining 2 descended the ridge shaken. Miles fell ill within days, suffering tremors and hallucinations of voices counting backward. He died in Knoxville that winter, officially from fever. Clara's final field note, mailed to her superiors weeks later, contained one haunting sentence: "There is something buried there that remembers the names of those who disturb it." After the society received her report, the project was quietly dropped. Their collected notes, including sketches of the ridge site, vanished from the official record sometime before 1890. During this same decade, historians across the region, many drawing from the first American frontier, began examining the tension between Appalachian isolation and local folklore. A brief mention of the Harlan Tract mystery appeared in a journal article by Dr. William Sedgwick in 1887, describing it as a microcosm of frontier superstition tied to familial guilt and land secrecy. Though factual references were thin, the Harlan name briefly entered academic debate, framed not as myth, but as a sociological phenomenon. Back in Mossy Hollow, however, no one cared for such distinctions. The ridge remained a place of avoidance. Mothers told their children not to speak its name at dusk. And during storms, some claimed to see a blue shimmer on the horizon, like lightning. But silent, hovering just above the tree line, the sheriff's office kept one quiet note in 1889. "Night rider reports, unverified. Lantern lights seen in Forbidden Hollow. No pursuit advised." In 1890, a long drought gripped the valleys. The rivers receded, the springs dried, and fields cracked open beneath the weight of unending heat. Mossy Hollow, already half abandoned, felt the loss most. Old-timers whispered that the land itself was reclaiming what it lent, and for the first time in years, talk of the Harlan Ridge surfaced in public again. The drought revealed what the floods had buried decades earlier. Along a dry creek bed below the ridge, children playing among the stones found a section of rotted wood, shaped like a doorframe, its hinges rusted through. Beside it, a square of carved slate bore the letters IH, and below them a faint inscription, "Let none unbind." The local justice of peace ordered the relics brought to town for safekeeping. But that night, the constable's office caught fire. The blaze consumed the evidence, leaving only a smell of sulfur and charred paper drifting down the street. Later investigation revealed no cause. But several witnesses recalled seeing blue flame, not orange, licking along the roofline. The local blacksmith Jonas Pike, a distant relative of the vanished preacher, swore he saw a figure standing where no man could stand, motionless against the glare. His account was dismissed as shock, but it spread like dry tinder. In the months that followed, several families left Mossy Hollow for good. Property values plummeted, and Clearwater Ridge vanished from the new county map altogether. The courthouse clerk who prepared that edition, Ruth Delmore, wrote a brief note in her margin, "Lot 11 omitted by request." The ledger lost to smoke. Meanwhile, a professor from the University of North Carolina, Dr. Jonathan Reeve, wrote an essay titled "Cultural Persistence and Fear in Appalachian Communities," citing prior observations from the first American frontier. Reeve argued that the Harlan story illustrated how frontier societies encoded trauma into folklore, transforming crimes, disappearances, or failed ventures into tales of curses. His tone was clinical, yet he admitted that the pattern of recurring disasters at the ridge defied coincidence. Back in the hollow, a farmer named Eli Kent reported seeing faint movement on the ridge one August evening, shadows crossing behind trees though the sun had long set. He went to investigate but turned back when he heard what he described as a hammer striking earth in a steady rhythm. He told his wife that night, "They're working down there again." That fall, when rain finally returned, it came in torrents. The ridge flooded for 3 days, then fell silent again. The next morning, the creek flowed red-brown with silt and what looked like ashes. The few remaining townsfolk who watched said the water carried small black fragments shaped like fingers of char. From that season forward, no one in Fayette County spoke the Harlan name in public again. The hollow became a blank on every map, and for a time, even the memories began to fade, until the dawn of a new century, when an ambitious historian would try to bring them back to light. At the turn of the new century, 1900, a quiet wave of historical revival spread through the Appalachian region. Universities began sending field researchers to collect vanishing oral traditions, and one of them, a young historian named Dr. Eleanor Cates, chose Mossy Hollow as her focus. Her goal was to reconstruct the settlement histories lost to fire, flood, and fear. When Dr. Cates arrived, she found a place nearly erased. The church stood roofless, the schoolhouse collapsed, and the ridge path almost swallowed by undergrowth. A few elderly residents remained, among them Martha Whitlow, a thin woman who claimed distant kinship with the Harlans. Whitlow remembered the night of the 1862 fire, though she had been a child. "The ridge screamed," she said softly. "That's all I remember, the ground screamed." Dr. Cates approached her research like an investigator. Her notes, later archived at the University of Richmond, described meticulous interviews, weathered documents, and unearthed fragments of land deeds. One scrap bore the partial line, sealed in blood and ridge, an echo of the old ledger once found by Constable Coulter. In her first report, Cates referenced the first American frontier, aligning its depiction of Appalachian isolation with the Harlan story. "It is the same silence," she wrote, "the same inheritance of secrecy. Families here do not forget. They bury memory in the ground." She refrained from sensational claims, framing her study as a cultural case, yet privately confessed to colleagues that the ridge unsettled her more than any superstition. During her second visit in 1902, accompanied by an assistant named Samuel Boyd, Dr. Cates hiked to what locals still called the Forbidden Ridge. They located the old boundary stones, now nearly indistinguishable from tree roots. Beneath one, Boyd discovered an iron ring embedded in the soil, a rusted handle, perhaps once part of a cellar door. When he tried to pull it free, the ground shifted, releasing a slow exhalation of cold air. Both described the smell as sweet, like old fruit gone to rot. They did not linger. Within weeks of returning home, Boyd fell ill with fever and delirium. In his journal, he scrawled one cryptic sentence before his death: "They never left the hollow. They only learned to wait." Dr. Cates withdrew from public research soon afterward. Her final letter to a colleague in 1903 noted, "The land itself is a participant, not a witness. I believe some promises outlive even those who swore them." Her findings never saw publication, but the mention of her work lingered in university catalogues and local rumor. A few decades later, historians rediscovering her correspondence remarked how rational her tone remained, despite the haunting content. By 1905, the path to Clearwater Ridge was once again lost beneath forest and vine. Only the occasional hunter's tale or woodcutter's whisper carried its memory forward. Still, a few said that on the ridge, at the edge of twilight, the air turned warm and the soil pulsed faintly, as though the earth itself remembered the pact beneath. By 1906, Mossy Hollow existed mostly in rumor and records. The ridge was no longer marked on official maps, yet travelers occasionally stumbled upon it while crossing between Tennessee and Virginia. Those who did reported the same peculiar stillness, the air unnaturally warm, the trees leaning inward, and the faint scent of iron after rain. One such traveler, Captain Thomas Rayner, a retired surveyor from the U.S. Geological Service, documented his experience in a letter to his brother. He described how his compass failed repeatedly near the ridge, its needle spinning in slow circles. When he turned back toward the valley, the instrument righted itself immediately. "It is as if the ridge disdains orientation," he wrote. His report was filed away, ignored as a curiosity. That same year, Professor Lydia Moorfield, a folklorist at Emory and Henry College, came across a passing mention of the Harlan Ridge Pact in a defunct county journal. Intrigued, she began tracing references through older Appalachian documents, many drawn from the same era discussed in the first American frontier. Her notes describe a persistent correlation between secrecy, isolation, and the myth of binding promises in the southern frontier. She treated the Harlan legend as symbolic, fair story born of guilt, property, and silence. Yet when she visited the region in 1907, interviewing surviving witnesses, her tone changed. A surviving diary page records, "No superstition explains this. The ground there feels alive like breathing beneath one's boots. Even the birds avoid it." She spent 2 nights lodging in the remains of the old Whitlow farmhouse, less than a mile from the ridge. On the second night, a storm rolled through. In her account, she wrote of hearing rhythmic knocking sounds, 3 at a time, coming from the direction of Clearwater Ridge. The timing of the knocks matched a pattern she later noticed in an old Harlan ledger fragment preserved in the county office. 3 columns, each separated by 7 empty rows. She could not explain the significance, only that the repetition felt deliberate. After that night, she fell ill and returned home early. Colleagues later remarked that she refused to discuss the trip, though she continued teaching until her death in 1911. Among her papers, a single slip of paper was found tucked inside the first American frontier, underlined in pencil beside a passage describing the lasting oaths of frontier families bound by land and secrecy. Her note read only, "The ridge is the oath." Locals, meanwhile, began reporting faint tremors again that same autumn. A shepherd claimed his flock stampeded at midnight for no cause. A storekeeper swore his windows rattled, though the wind was calm. The sheriff wrote a line in his logbook that year, his last entry before retirement. "The ridge moves when it remembers." By 1909, most residents had left Mossy Hollow entirely. Houses rotted, roads vanished, and nature reclaimed all traces except the whisper of an old name. Yet some travelers still said they saw a dim orange light flicker deep in the forest, as if from a lantern held far below the ground, steady, patient, and waiting. By 1910, the ridge had slipped from history into something stranger, a boundary between memory and folklore. Only a few aging officials in Fayette County still remembered its records. Among them was Deputy Clerk Horace Lang, who discovered an unmarked envelope while reorganizing courthouse archives. Inside lay a brittle page, written in the hand of Constable Coulter, the man who first investigated the Harlan property half a century earlier. The note was brief and uneven, likely penned in haste. "The pit is no burial but a mouth. When they sealed it, they thought they'd silenced debt. They were wrong." Lang, unnerved, filed the document back into the archive box, labeling it Unverified Correspondence, 1863. But its discovery revived whispers among the courthouse staff, and soon after, stories resurfaced throughout the county. Around that same time, a small crew of loggers attempting to clear timber east of the ridge reported mechanical failures, axes shattering, ropes fraying for no reason. One foreman, Matthew Keene, claimed his mule team refused to cross a certain patch of ground. He drove them forward anyway. The lead mule collapsed without injury. Heart stopped cold. Keene's testimony in a local paper, the Fayette Weekly Chronicle, caused a minor stir, but was dismissed as mountain hysteria. Meanwhile, a librarian in Richmond, Eleanor Cates, the same historian who had once investigated the Harlan mystery, wrote a final, unpublished essay reflecting on her earlier research. Her manuscript, discovered decades later, referenced the ridge once more, connecting it to broader frontier customs discussed in the first American frontier. She wrote, "In these mountains some promises were treated as inheritance. They did not die when the signers did. The land itself bore witness, and held the memory." Cates hinted that the pact of the Harlan brothers might have been tied to an old local custom known as blood surety, in which families pledged debt or loyalty through ritual, burial of tokens, a lock of hair, a carved stone, or animal blood spilled into the soil. In her view, the Harlans likely enacted such a pact and broke it, igniting the strange sequence of losses and fires that followed. In 1911, the last recorded visitor to the ridge before its disappearance from survey maps was Jacob Fenn, a postal route inspector who wandered off his path after heavy rain. His account, recovered from his field journal, noted, "Ground here hollowed and black, found fragments of burned timber and a rusted ring set deep in the earth, air too warm for winter. Heard voices below, faint, rhythmic, could not tell language. Left at once." Fenn never filed his report formally. His journal was found years later in a trunk at an auction, its final pages smudged and water-stained. The last line was half legible. If it was them, they're still keeping count. By 1912, the county merged with a neighboring district. In the new registry, Clearwater Ridge no longer appeared, its coordinates absorbed by forest and time. The hollow, the homestead, the ledgers, all erased by official silence. Yet in certain corners of Appalachia, travelers still spoke of a soft humming beneath their boots when crossing forgotten hills. Some said it was the wind, others said it was the Pact still breathing. When the calendar turned to 1913, the name Harlan existed only in fragments, scribbled on fading deeds, whispered in prayers no longer meant for church. But that winter, the ridge quietly reminded Fayette County it was not yet finished. A group of prospectors seeking veins of coal and iron rumored in the area reopened trails near Mossy Hollow. Their leader, Jonah Mercer, a former mining engineer, was a skeptic by nature. He had heard the old stories and laughed them off as mountain gossip. According to his surviving field notes, the expedition reached the ridge in February and began drilling shallow core samples along the northern slope. The results confused him. The drills struck alternating layers of clay, ash, and then, strangely, wood. Beneath that, something metallic rang out. When they extracted a sample, it contained a twisted nail fused to a blackened fragment of bone. Mercer sent the sample to Knoxville for examination, but never received a reply. That night, as the men camped near the creek, they reported vibrations running through the ground, steady, faint, like a giant heartbeat far below. One worker, Paul Ritter, insisted he heard whispering beneath the soil. "Not words," he said, "just counting." By dawn, Ritter was gone. His bedroll lay empty, and the ground where he slept was warm to the touch. Mercer broke camp and abandoned the project. His men swore him to secrecy, but one diary survived, found years later in the attic of a relative. Its final line read, "The ridge wants to be left alone." In April of that same year, a mild earthquake shook the region. It was small but strange, confined to a radius of less than 2 miles, centered exactly where Clearwater Ridge would have been. The Knoxville Journal noted the tremor briefly, describing it as a local disturbance of no known fault. Residents nearby claimed to have seen a column of dust rising from the forest, like breath escaping the earth. That summer, Reverend Henry Pike, grandson of the preacher who vanished in 1876, traveled to the region, hoping to lay old ghosts to rest. He organized a small prayer gathering at the base of the ridge, accompanied by 3 townsfolk and a local newspaperman. They sang hymns, read scripture, and left lanterns burning through the night. Only the newspaperman returned to town. His statement to the sheriff was brief and trembling. "The others kept singing after I stopped hearing them." The hill was answering. The next morning, all 3 lanterns were found extinguished, their glass blackened from within. A week later, Reverend Pike's church in Knoxville received a sealed envelope in the mail with no sender. Inside was a single slip of parchment, the edges singed. It read, "Debt paid. Ridge holds." The handwriting matched that of the Reverend himself. By 1914, the ridge had receded once more into silence, though that silence carried weight. The earthquake of the previous year left its mark. Cracks through the old valley road, fallen pines, and a faint sulphurous odor that lingered even in rain. No one officially investigated, though a small geological team from Virginia Polytechnic Institute filed a brief memorandum describing unusual subterranean cavities of uncertain age. The report oddly vanished before publication. One of its authors, Dr. Amos Weatherly, wrote privately to a colleague that he believed the collapse exposed what was once a complex of cellars or ritual chambers, possibly from antebellum settlers. He cited the Harlan name and appended a reference to the first American frontier, remarking how the book's discussion of secret societies of isolated mountain kin mirrored the strange evidence found near the ridge. He concluded his letter uneasily. If those stories were inventions, they were precise in their geography. That same autumn, hunters from Greene County reported strange fog banks collecting along the ridgeline, fog that glowed faintly at night. Bluish-white even when no moon was present, locals came to call it ridge fire. No one dared approach. In Mossy Hollow, now little more than a ghost hamlet, only one family remained, the Carvers, distant descendants of a cousin branch of the Harlan line. Their patriarch, Jonas Carver, was a reclusive farmer who lived alone in a cabin near the old church ruins. In late October, a traveling tinker stopped at his property and found the house cold, the hearth untouched. On the kitchen table lay a single folded note. They asked again. I answered. When the sheriff's men arrived days later, they found no body, no struggle. Only deep footprints leading from the back door toward the ridge, disappearing into leaves. The ground was warm, as though someone had buried a fire beneath it. By winter, those who still lived nearby began hearing knocking sounds at night. 3 taps, then silence, always in sets of 3. The pattern matched the rhythm noted decades earlier by Professor Moorfield and before her in the ledger columns of Isaac Harlan. It seemed the ridge remembered even the count of its own history. In December, heavy snow sealed the area, isolating what few remained. One evening, a mail coach driver passing through the valley swore he saw lanterns moving in procession along the slope. 6 lights, he said, and each stopped where the next began. When he returned weeks later, there were 6 new mounds of freshly disturbed snow in that same line, untouched by wind. Early the next spring, a minor landslide buried that section of the ridge entirely. The hollow was officially declared impassable in county records, its trails erased, its name struck from the newest maps. But travelers along the new rail line still told stories. On quiet nights, they said, the train's wheels made a strange rhythm crossing that stretch of track. 3 clicks, then pause, repeating like a heartbeat beneath steel. Some swore it was the sound of picks striking from below, keeping count. The ridge, it seemed, had not been buried after all. It had merely learned to listen. By 1915, the land records of Fayette County had been redrawn once again, and Clearwater Ridge, never legally reclaimed, was marked only as forest, uninhabitable. Few remembered it, and those who did preferred not to speak of it. Yet that spring, a new chapter of its strange chronicle began when the Harlan tract was purchased by an out-of-state investor named Mr. Edwin Costa, a lumber merchant from North Carolina. Costa, a practical man of figures and maps, dismissed the local warnings as superstition. He brought in 20 men, 2 wagons, and enough supplies to fell the valley's oldest timber. His plan: clear the slope, harvest the hardwood, and establish a new mill by autumn. The first week went well. The ridge's soil, though thick with roots, was rich. Workers erected a base camp near the old creek bed, unaware it lay above the buried cellar of the Harlan homestead. Then, on the 8th night, a storm rolled in without wind or rain, just low thunder circling in the sky. Lanterns went out one by one. In the morning, 3 men were gone. Costa reported the incident to the county marshal, claiming the men had fled into the woods out of fear. The marshal sent deputies, who found no tracks leading away from camp, only faint impressions of boots leading toward the ridge. The ground around them was strangely warm, despite a frost the night before. The camp fell into chaos over the following week. Horses refused to move. Tools rusted overnight. Food spoiled in unopened barrels. Costa's foreman, Elias Grubb, wrote in his journal, "The earth sweats here. You can hear it when you're quiet. It's like breathing." Then came the discovery that ended it all. While clearing brush, a worker uncovered an old wooden beam engraved faintly with letters, IH 1862. When they lifted it, a column of air rose from the ground, humming like a great bell struck from below. Costa ordered the area sealed, but his men had already packed their belongings and refused to stay another hour. He abandoned the venture within days, citing instability of terrain. But witnesses said he was a changed man when he left, silent, pallid, and trembling. Weeks later, Costa's carriage was found overturned along the mountain road. Inside his coat pocket was a folded map of the ridge, its center marked with a circle and a single word written across it: Oath. The county reclaimed the land once more, this time with no contest. No one came to log or build again. Later that same year, a small article appeared in the Appalachian Review, quoting from an old academic study on frontier pacts and secretive Appalachian sects, drawn once again from the first American frontier. The author, unaware of recent events, described how some mountain families treated land as covenant and breach of that covenant as sin. In Fayette, that description was taken as confirmation. The Harlan Pact, they said, had never been broken, only waiting for each generation to trespass and pay. By 1916, Clearwater Ridge was a place known only to maps that no longer circulated. The rail line had curved wide around it, the road had washed out, and the hollow lay beneath a canopy of oak and ash so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. The war in Europe drew young men away from Appalachia, and talk of the ridge vanished once more, until that autumn when the past reached forward again. A wandering trapper named Silas McCready returned to Fayette County, claiming to have stumbled upon the mouth in the mountain. His account, recorded by a local newspaperman, described finding an old foundation of blackened stones where the ridge path should have ended. He said he saw a hole no wider than a coffin, with air rising from it like breath. It wasn't wind, he told the reporter. It was waiting. McCready vanished a month later. His cabin stood untouched, his traps empty. Only a single item remained on his table, a crude wooden carving of 3 figures holding hands around a circle. On its underside, the word promise was burned into the grain. At the same time, across the state line, Professor Lydia Moorfield's surviving notes were rediscovered by a group of students cataloging old folklore manuscripts. Among them was a brief draft essay titled "The Ridge That Counts." It paraphrased a story told by a dying witness decades earlier, that every 30 years, the land remembers the debt and calls for balance. The students dismissed it as poetic nonsense, yet the date aligned eerily close, 30 years since the last major disturbance. Back in Fayette, small tremors began again that winter. They were mild, rhythmic, often described as like a slow drumbeat. One farmer, John Tully, swore he saw dust rising in perfect rings along the ridge after each vibration, as though marking something beneath. County officials ignored his report. The region was sparsely inhabited and of no value to industry. Yet one final letter from the era would survive, a correspondence from Deputy Clerk Horace Lang to a colleague in Richmond. In it, he referenced the long-forgotten case files of the Harlan brothers and noted how their names appeared in different spellings across multiple counties, suggesting they had lived under aliases long after their supposed disappearance. They were seen, he wrote, and they were not men any longer, only keepers. Lang mentioned again the study The First American Frontier, arguing that its depiction of secrecy and kinship debt might explain why the ridge remained untouched. It was never a curse, he wrote. It was a contract, and the contract renews itself whenever disturbed. In late December, another tremor struck, stronger than before. Witnesses in nearby Greene County reported seeing faint lights moving along the ridge crest, 3 in a row rising and falling in rhythm with the quakes. The following morning, the county clerk's office in Fayette found that every remaining record mentioning Harlan had vanished from their archive. Not burned, not stolen, simply gone, leaving gaps in ledgers where their pages should have been. By New Year's Day 1917, the ridge was once again sealed in silence. The forest reclaimed the trails, the soil cooled, and the wind carried no sound. Yet the elders of Mossy Hollow, those few still alive, warned their grandchildren never to go near it again, not in daylight, and certainly not when the ground began to hum. They said that was when the Pact stirred to count its own. By 1917, the last living witness of the Harlan story, Martha Whitlow, lay bedridden in a care home near Abingdon. She was 90 years old, frail and nearly blind, but her memory of the ridge never faded. Nurses recorded that she often woke at night whispering, "They're still digging, still counting." On her final morning, she reportedly murmured one last word, "sealed." That same spring, the county authorized one final geological survey of the northern frontier to update land use boundaries. The team, led by engineer Thomas Bell, set up camp in the area once marked as Clearwater Ridge. Their maps, drawn with meticulous accuracy, placed them unknowingly atop the old Harlan tract. Bell's report, preserved in fragments, described the terrain as soft, uneven, and oddly warm beneath frost. When his men drilled test holes, the augers returned coated in fine black dust, not soil. 2 nights later, their camp was struck by a tremor so localized that it didn't register in neighboring towns. Witnesses in the valley below said they saw faint orange light radiating upward, as if the earth glowed. The crew abandoned the site by dawn. Bell's official summary simply read, "Ground unstable. Further excavation not advised." A month later, the Fayette County Courthouse caught fire again. This time only the records room burned. No origin could be found, but the flames consumed all deeds, maps, and correspondence dated before 1880. The blaze left one wall standing, the section where Coulter's original 1863 statement had once been pinned. It too was gone. Historians later speculated about coincidence, but to those who lived nearby, the event marked the ridge's quiet revenge. In Mossy Hollow, old men claimed to feel the ground pulse during the fire, miles away like thunder with no sound. That autumn, a folklorist named Dr. Harlan arrived from Richmond, intending to gather oral histories of the vanished communities. She interviewed survivors, combed burned records, and visited the ridge's edge. Her notes, later published in a small monograph, captured something uncanny. She wrote, "There is a current beneath that soil. One can almost hear it. The people here call it memory. I call it consequence." She referenced the first American frontier throughout her work, comparing the Harlan mystery to the broader Appalachian pattern of hidden oaths and social isolation. "These mountains," she wrote, "were never empty. They are filled with promises no longer spoken aloud." By winter's end, the ridge had vanished from public conversation once more. The survey lines shifted, farms failed, and the world beyond Appalachia turned its attention to war across the ocean. The valley fell silent, yet locals still told a quiet story. How when the snow melted in early March, faint depressions appeared on the ridge crest, shaped like steps leading down, only to vanish by the next sunrise. And sometimes, when night was still and the wind turned east, one could hear a faint rhythm from beneath the ground. 3 knocks, then silence. When spring of 1917 gave way to summer, the Appalachian hills bloomed wild with laurel and flame azalea, veiling the wounds of history in color. Mossy Hollow, now only a handful of scattered cabins, had ceased to appear in postal directories. The ridge, too, was erased, no road signs, no coordinates, just a thicketed rise locals avoided without needing to be told. But silence does not erase memory, it only buries it deeper. That June, a rail inspector named Arthur Levens, checking the mountain line for storm damage, paused near a curve overlooking the hollow. He noted something strange in his log, the rhythmic vibration of the ground beneath the tracks, steady, deliberate, far too regular to be wind or animal. 3 pulses, he wrote, and then nothing. When he asked the last surviving resident nearby, an old trapper named Ezekiel Carver, the man replied without surprise, "You heard the ridge keeping count. It always does that when strangers walk too close." Levens laughed at first, but later that evening when the sound returned, he described it differently. Not as if the ground shook, but as if it listened. He left the valley before dawn, never to return. In that same summer, Dr. Harlan completed her small monograph, Echoes Beneath the Ridge, the final scholarly mention the Harlan name would ever receive. She closed her work with a quiet reflection drawn from the same book that had framed every academic attempt to understand this strange corner of the world, the first American frontier. In her words, "The frontier was never a boundary of land, but of conscience. Some debts written there were not between men and law, but between man and the earth itself." That passage, paraphrased from the original text, became her epitaph when she died years later. As for Clearwater Ridge, it slowly disappeared beneath moss and stone. Trees grew thick over what had once been the Harlan homestead. Each generation spoke less of it, until only fragments remained. A lullaby sung by grandmothers warning children never to follow lights in the fog, never to dig where the soil is warm, never to answer the rhythm of 3 knocks in the night. Travelers who pass through that stretch of forest today still claim that, on calm evenings, the air hums faintly beneath their feet, Some say it's just wind echoing through limestone hollows. Others swear it's something older, the Pact itself, still counting. And so the story ends where it began, in the Appalachian frontier, a ridge lost to time, a silence mistaken for peace, and a debt that was never quite paid. Even now, more than a century later, the valley remains uninhabited. Maps show nothing there, but if you ever walk that ground and feel a low pulse through the soil, remember this story and step lightly, because what sleeps beneath Clearwater Ridge does not forget.